Think about the version of yourself you present at work, or at a family dinner, or on a first date, or in a room full of people you want to impress. That version is not fake exactly. It is not a lie. It is a carefully edited selection of who you are, the parts that feel safe to show, the parts that fit the situation, the parts that have learned over years of social experience to come forward, and the parts that have learned to stay back. Carl Jung called this the persona, named after the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theatre, the literal object held in front of the face to signal to the audience who the character was. The persona is necessary. Jung never said otherwise. The problem is what happens when you wear it for so long that you stop knowing where the mask ends and your face begins. When the edited version becomes the only version. When the performance of yourself replaces the self it was meant to represent. This is part 2 of our Jung series. Tonight, the persona. What it is, why you built it, and what it cost you to keep it on. In part 1, we explored the shadow, the parts of yourself you pushed into the unconscious because they were unacceptable to the world around you. The persona is the other side of that same process. While the shadow was forming in the dark, accumulating everything you rejected, the persona was forming in the light. The curated presentation of self that you developed in response to what the world seemed to reward. The version of you that got approval, that fit in, that navigated social environments successfully. The shadow is what you hid. The persona is what you showed instead. They were built together, simultaneously, as two sides of the same adaptation. And understanding them together is what Jung considered the first real step toward knowing who you actually are. The persona begins forming very early. Before you have the language to understand what is happening, you are already reading the room, sensing which expressions of yourself produce warmth and which produce withdrawal, which behaviors bring you closer to the people you need, and which create distance. A child who discovers that being funny gets attention will develop a funny persona. A child who discovers that being helpful keeps the peace will develop a helpful one. A child who discovers that being strong and uncomplaining produces more love than being vulnerable will develop a strong one, and bury the vulnerability in the shadow where it continues to exist unseen. None of this is conscious. None of it is manipulative. It is simply the natural human process of learning to exist in relationship with other people, of developing the social self that allows you to function in a world that has expectations, norms, and consequences for deviation from them. The persona is not pathological. It is necessary, even healthy, up to a point. The point at which it becomes a problem is the point at which you lose track of the difference between the persona and yourself. Jung described this as identification with the persona, the state in which a person has so thoroughly merged with their social role that they can no longer distinguish between who they are performing and who they actually are. The successful businessman, who has been the successful businessman for so long that he genuinely cannot tell you what he wants outside of success. The caretaker who has been caring for others for so long that the question of what she needs is not just unanswered, but genuinely incomprehensible to her. The strong one who has been strong for so long that the first tremor of genuine vulnerability feels like personal failure rather than humanity. In each case, the persona has not just covered the self, it has replaced it, at least in the person's own experience of themselves. The mask has become the face, and the real face, whatever it was, has become inaccessible. The cost of prolonged persona identification is something most people feel long before they understand what is causing it. It feels like a persistent flatness, like going through the motions of a life that looks correct from the outside, but produces less and less genuine feeling from the inside. Like being vaguely disconnected from your own experience, present at the events of your life, but somehow not quite inside them. Like performing a role that used to feel like living, and has gradually come to feel like work. Jung called this a loss of soul, not in a religious sense, in a psychological one. The animated center of a person, the part that has genuine responses and genuine desires and genuine connection to experience, has been buried under so many layers of performed self that it can no longer be heard clearly. The relationships that persona identification produces are particularly painful to examine, because they are real relationships, genuinely felt, genuinely valued, and yet they are built on a foundation that cannot fully hold. When you are primarily in persona, when what you are presenting to the people closest to you is the edited, curated, acceptable version, rather than the full one, the love and connection you receive is love and connection directed at the persona, at the performance, at the version of you that you constructed rather than the one that actually exists. This produces a specific kind of loneliness that is very difficult to name while you are inside it. You are surrounded by people who care about you, and yet you feel unseen, because what is being seen is not quite you, and the gap between the care they are offering and the self it is being offered to, that gap is the loneliness, the disconnection between the face they see and the face behind it. Many people live their entire lives in that gap without ever finding the language for what is wrong. There is another cost that Jung identified, one that is less personal and more structural. When you are heavily identified with your persona, your shadow grows correspondingly larger and more powerful. Remember from part 1, everything that cannot be integrated into the conscious self goes into the shadow. The more rigid and defended the persona, the more material gets pushed into the shadow. The more that gets pushed into the shadow, the more it accumulates pressure. And the more pressure it accumulates, the more dramatically it eventually erupts. In projections, in disproportionate reactions, in the sudden collapse of someone who appeared, from the outside, to have everything together. The person who presents as perpetually calm and controlled and never acknowledges anger is not a person without anger. They are a person whose anger is building in the shadow, unseen and unmanaged, until it finds an outlet, usually at the worst possible moment, in a way that surprises everyone, including themselves. The persona and the shadow are in a direct relationship. Strengthen one, and you inevitably feed the other. The solution to persona identification is not to abandon the persona entirely. Jung was clear about this. The persona is a necessary social tool. Without some version of it, human social life would be impossible. You cannot walk into every room as the completely unfiltered, unedited version of yourself. That is not authenticity. That is a failure of social functioning. The solution is what Jung called a healthy relationship to the persona, wearing it consciously rather than unconsciously, knowing you are putting it on when you need it and taking it off when you don't, maintaining the distinction between the social self and the deeper self underneath, not as a performance of authenticity, but as a genuine ongoing awareness. In practice, this looks like asking a question that most people find surprisingly difficult. Who are you when nobody is watching? Not who do you think you should be? Not who would you like to be? Who are you actually? In the private moments, in the thoughts that come before you've had time to edit them, in the desires and responses and reactions that exist before the persona has had a chance to process them into acceptability. For people who have been heavily in persona for a long time, this question produces a particular kind of blankness, not because there is nothing there, but because the habit of immediately editing and presenting has become so automatic that the unedited version is genuinely difficult to access. The persona answers the question before the self can. This is where the work begins. Not in dramatic confrontation, but in small, sustained acts of honest self-observation, noticing the moments when you perform rather than respond, when you give the expected answer rather than the true one, when you present the appropriate emotion rather than the actual one. Not to judge yourself for these moments, they are habitual and largely unconscious, but simply to see them, to introduce a small gap between the persona and the self that wore it. Jung believed that the people we are most drawn to, the ones who feel most alive to us, most real, most genuinely present, are usually people with a relatively thin persona, people who have not armored themselves so completely that the actual self is inaccessible. People in whose company you feel, somehow, permission to be slightly more yourself than usual. That feeling, the relief of being with someone whose realness gives you permission for your own, is the feeling of two selves making contact rather than two personas performing at each other. It is rarer than it should be. And when you find it, you know it immediately, even if you cannot explain why. What Jung was pointing toward, in the shadow work, in the persona work, in the whole project of individuation that these first steps are building toward, was the possibility of that quality of contact becoming the norm rather than the exception. Not just in rare relationships, but in your relationship with yourself. The ongoing, daily, imperfect practice of being someone you actually recognize. The mask was built to protect you. In many ways, it did exactly that. It got you through situations that the unprotected self might not have survived. There is nothing wrong with having built it. The question Jung kept asking, the one this series keeps returning to, is whether you still need it as much as you think you do, whether the protection it offers is worth what it costs, whether the face behind it has been waiting long enough. Next time in the Jung series, individuation, the lifelong process of becoming, as fully as possible, the person you actually are, what it looks like, what it requires, and why Jung considered it the central task of a human life.